My mom said Grandpa's inheritance was just trash to burn, but I did the opposite, became a millionaire. You know those moments when life hands you what seems like trash, but turns out to be treasure? I never believed in that crap. Not until 3 weeks ago when I inherited a rusty trailer in the Nevada desert and a box of what my mom called worthless junk. My name's Thomas. I'm 28, a struggling journalist with student loans bigger than my ambitions, and now, apparently, the proud owner of the most depressing piece of real estate this side of Death Valley. Thanks, Grandpa. The call from my mother came on a Tuesday. Her voice was all business, sharp as a knife cutting through the static of my cheap phone. Your grandfather's lawyer called. He left you that old trailer and some boxes. Just burn the junk and sell the trailer. Move on with your life. Move on. That's been my family's mantra ever since I chose journalism over law school 5 years ago. Dad stopped talking to me entirely. Mom limited our conversations to thinly veiled disappointment and job listings for corporate positions. Only Grandpa Jack stood by me, slipping $20 bills and a birthday card with notes saying, "Keep chasing the truth, kid." And now he was gone. Heart attack at 78. No warning, just gone. I drove out to the trailer the next day, my beat-up Honda protesting every mile through the desert heat. The Nevada landscape stretched endlessly around me, all dust, scrub brush, and broken dreams. Perfect backdrop for what was surely going to be a depressing errand. The GPS led me down a winding dirt road to what looked like a relic from another era. The trailer sat alone against the harsh landscape, faded blue paint peeling under the merciless sun. A 1970s Airstream that had seen better days about 3 decades ago. I sat in my car for a good 5 minutes, engine off, just staring at my inheritance. If this was my legacy, I was officially the emperor of junk. The key stuck in the lock, needing a firm jiggle before the door creaked open. The smell hit me immediately. Old coffee, dust, and something else. Something like faded ambition and memories. The space was cramped but meticulously organized. Everything had its place, just like Grandpa's mind. Inside, it was like stepping into a time machine set for 1978, with paneling, vintage appliances with rounded edges, a small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed with a faded quilt, and everywhere, absolutely everywhere, were stacks of yellow paper, scripts, screenplays, notes scribbled in Grandpa's distinctive handwriting. I'd almost forgotten that before he retired to work as a hardware store manager, Grandpa had spent 2 decades in Hollywood as a screenwriter. Nothing major, a few TV episodes, some uncredited rewrites. But he'd always spoken about those years like they were magic. On the wall hung a sun-bleached poster for some western I'd never heard of, Rawhide Junction. Grandpa had a story by credit at the bottom. Below the poster, more boxes of papers, carefully labeled by year. Against one wall sat an ancient TV with a built-in VCR, the kind that weighed about 50 pounds and probably got 3 channels on a good day. Next to it, a small wooden shelf held a row of VHS tapes with handwritten labels. I collapsed into a worn armchair, raising a cloud of dust that danced in the beams of late afternoon sunlight, streaming through the blinds. The silence was absolute except for the occasional creak of metal expanding in the heat. My eyes caught a framed photo on a small desk. Grandpa, maybe 30 years younger, his arm around a young man I recognized as Hollywood legend Robert Redford, both smiling, cigars in hand. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. This was all I had left of him now, fading photographs and a trailer full of paper dreams. What do you do when the only person who believed in you is gone? When everyone else sees your passion as a waste of time? Grandpa's voice seemed to echo in my head. Most people go through life without ever finding their story, Tommy. Don't be most people. I'd been putting off the actual task of sorting through his things, but the sun was getting low, and I still had a 2-hour drive back to my apartment in Vegas. With a sigh, I pulled open the first drawer of his desk. Inside was a small metal box. Not cardboard like the others, but actual brushed steel with an engraving that read, "Burnt Hearts." Something about it felt different. Important. I lifted it carefully, surprised by its weight. The lid opened with a satisfying click to reveal a VHS tape and a bound screenplay. The screenplay was well-worn, its pages dog-eared and covered in Grandpa's handwriting. Notes cramming every margin, whole paragraphs circled, arrows connecting different sections. The title page read Burnt Hearts by Jack Thomas, my grandfather. Below, in red ink that had faded to rust, someone had stamped rejected, production canceled, 1976. I flipped through the pages, catching snippets about passionate love, betrayal, and some kind of buried secret. More intriguing were Grandpa's margin notes. They're afraid of this truth, and S said it's too close to home for the studio. The VHS tape had a simple label in Grandpa's handwriting. For Thomas, when I'm gone. My heart pounded as I looked between the screenplay and the tape. This wasn't just another failed project. This was something he'd saved specifically for me. The trailer suddenly felt different. Not a sad inheritance, but a time capsule, preserved for this moment. I felt like an archaeologist discovering a hidden tomb, except instead of cursed mummies, I'd found my grandfather's buried secrets. I slid the tape into the ancient VCR, half expecting it not to work. But the machine whirred to life, hungrily accepting the cassette. The TV flickered with static before an image appeared. Grandpa, sitting in this very trailer, looking directly into the camera. He looked older than in my memories, his face more lined, hair thinner, but his eyes held that same fierce intelligence that had always made me feel like he could see right through people's bullshit. His voice came through the speakers, gravelly from decades of cigarettes, but strong. Thomas, if you're watching this, I'm gone, but what I'm leaving you is more valuable than money. It's truth, and truth never dies. It just waits for the right person to tell it. The camera pulled back to reveal the screenplay on his lap, the same one I now held in my hands. This story scared Hollywood, Tommy. Scared them so bad they buried it. The pilot was shot, the series was greenlit, and then suddenly, nothing. Erased, like it never existed. He leaned closer to camera, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. This wasn't just another show. It was based on real events. Things I witnessed during my time in the industry. Things powerful people didn't want told, not even as fiction. They paid a lot of money to make sure this story disappeared. I stared at the screen, transfixed. Grandpa had never mentioned anything like this to me. But you, Tommy, you're a journalist. You have what I never had. The courage to stand up and tell the truth, no matter the consequences. That script in your hands, it could be your biggest story yet. You can bring it back to life. I felt a chill despite the desert heat. The screenplay in my hands suddenly felt heavier, more significant. The rest of the tape was Grandpa explaining the story behind Burnt Hearts, how it was inspired by a real-life love affair between a studio head and an up-and-coming actress in the early 70s. How that relationship exposed corruption that reached into politics. How when the screenplay started circulating, mysterious things started happening until finally, the entire project was shut down and all copies of the footage supposedly destroyed. Except Grandpa had kept one tape, and the original screenplay. I remember watching old films with him when I was a kid, sprawled on his living room floor with bowls of microwave popcorn. He'd pause the movies constantly, leaning forward to whisper, "Each frame is someone's soul, Tommy. Remember that. Every story is someone bearing their truth to the world." Those were the moments when I decided to become a journalist, not for the bylines or the prestige, but because Grandpa taught me that stories matter, that truth matters. As the tape ended, I sat in the gathering darkness of the trailer, the screenplay clutched in my hands. Outside, the desert night was settling in, stars beginning to appear in the vast Nevada sky. One of Grandpa's favorite sayings echoed in my mind. Life isn't what you have. It's what you choose to tell. I've been struggling for years, writing fluff pieces about local businesses and editing copy for a barely-read Vegas culture magazine. My big investigative pieces kept getting rejected. My parents thought I was wasting my potential. Even I was starting to wonder if they were right. But sitting there, in that time capsule of a trailer with Grandpa's greatest untold story in my hands, something shifted inside me, a renewed sense of purpose. I looked down at the VHS tape and mumbled, "If this is treasure, I'm officially the poorest pirate in Nevada." But for the first time in months, I felt something like hope. The trailer wasn't just a rusty hand-me-down. It was Grandpa's final gift, a second chance at the story I'd always wanted to tell. My shot at proving everyone wrong. The clock on the wall read 9:30 p.m. Too late to drive back to Vegas tonight. Somehow, that thought didn't bother me. I belonged here, at least for now, with Grandpa's words in his story. I found sheets in a small closet and made up the narrow bed. The mattress smelled of dust and distant memories, but it was surprisingly comfortable. Through the small window above the bed, I could see more stars than I'd ever noticed from my apartment in the city. Before sleep took me, I reached for the screenplay again, running my fingers over Grandpa's handwriting in the margins. Tomorrow, I would read it properly. I would understand why this story had been buried. Morning arrived with harsh sunlight streaming through the windows. I woke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where I was until my eyes landed on the Burnt Hearts screenplay on the nightstand. I made coffee in an ancient percolator I found in the kitchenette, then sat at the small table and began to read. 2 hours later, I sat back, stunned. The story was brilliant, a complex tale of love and corruption in 1970s Hollywood that felt incredibly relevant even today. Grandpa's writing was sharp, incisive, emotional. I could see why a studio would have been interested and why certain people might have wanted it buried. I spent the rest of the day exploring the trailer, finding more of Grandpa's work. Some finished, some just fragments. Each page showed his brilliance, his eye for human truth. In one drawer, I found old letters from producers and actors praising his talent. In another, rejection letters that proved how close he'd come to the success he deserved. By evening, I knew what I needed to do. I found an old VCR video camera in one of the storage compartments. It still worked, amazingly, when I plugged it in and tested it. I set it up facing the small table, adjusted the frame, and hit record. Taking a deep breath, I sat down before the camera. For the first time in months, I felt like a real journalist again. Someone with a purpose, a story that mattered. I held up the screenplay, letting the camera see its faded cover. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice steady despite the emotion tight in my throat. "I'm going to tell your story." The ancient TV screen filled with white noise as I inserted the tape. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, determined, changed. This wasn't just about a forgotten screenplay anymore. This was about truth, about legacy, about proving that sometimes what looks like trash is actually the greatest treasure of all. "Grandpa," I whispered again as the screen flickered to life. "I'll tell your story. I promise." I woke up the next morning with a strange mix of purpose and doubt. The trailer felt different in the daylight, less like a dusty relic, and more like a weird time capsule on my grandfather's life. I'd spent the night alternating between reading his screenplay and watching his message to me on that old tape. It was good, really good. Not just my grandfather wrote us have to say that good, but actually legitimately good. The kind of story that makes you forget to breathe. I sat at the small fold-out table, drinking coffee from a cracked mug with Best Grandpa faded across the side. My laptop was open, but I wasn't writing anything for my usual gigs. Instead, I was staring at the TikTok app I downloaded a month ago, but barely used. My journalism career was going nowhere fast. 5 years of grinding out clickbait articles and local business profiles had left me with nothing but student debt and a growing sense that maybe my parents were right. Maybe chasing the truth was for suckers. But Grandpa's voice kept echoing in my head. You can bring it back to life. Without overthinking it, I hit record. The desert sunlight streamed through the trailer windows, casting everything in a golden glow that made even the decades-old furniture look almost romantic. "My name's Thomas." I began, holding up the screenplay. "My inheritance? A bunch of junk in this tape." I gestured around the trailer. "My grandfather was a screenwriter who died believing his greatest story got buried by Hollywood. I found his message to me last night." I read a passage from the screenplay, a scene where the main character discovers that the love of his life has been using him to expose corruption in the studio system. Love burns, but truth rises from the ashes. My voice shook a little. but I try to play it cool. If this doesn't take off, I'll be selling this trailer on eBay next week. Stay tuned for that disaster. I posted it without thinking too hard, then closed my laptop and spent the rest of the day going through more of Grandpa's boxes, old photographs, notes for projects that never got made, letters from actors and directors who'd worked with him. It was like discovering a whole side of him I'd never known. I fell asleep that night surrounded by his papers, my phone forgotten on the table. When I checked it the next morning, I nearly choked on my coffee. 4 million views. Overnight, the comments section had exploded. Is this a screenplay or your actual soul? I felt that passage in my bones. That trailer is giving me serious 70s vibes, and I'm here for it. Wait, your grandpa worked in Hollywood? Spill the tea. I would watch the hell out of whatever this burnt hearts thing is. I sat there, stunned, scrolling through thousands of comments. People tagging their friends. People asking for more. People sharing their own stories of family secrets and lost dreams. My hands were actually shaking as I recorded a follow-up, showing more of the trailer and explaining a bit more about Grandpa's career. The crazy thing is, I said, he believed the story was killed because it hit too close to home for some powerful people, not just fictional, based on real events. I posted it, and the second video hit 1 million views in 2 hours. That's when the DM came in. Your grandfather was a genius. I'm a documentary filmmaker from Austin. We should talk. Would you consider meeting in Los Angeles? Sara. I clicked on her profile. Sara Chun, 30, with a respectable following and links to several short documentaries that had won festival awards. She looked serious in her profile picture, intense eyes behind trendy glasses, the kind of person who doesn't smile for photos because she's too busy thinking about camera angles. Her words felt like a spark in darkness. For the first time in years, someone was taking my grandfather's work, and by extension me, seriously. I messaged her back immediately, trying not to sound too eager. LA sounds good. I've got some leads on people who might remember the original project. That wasn't entirely true. I had exactly 0 leads. But somehow, sitting in Grandpa's trailer with millions of people suddenly interested in his story, anything seemed possible. I spent the next 48 hours in a frenzy, digging deeper into Grandpa's boxes, finding old industry directories, and searching online for anyone connected to the original Burnt Hearts project. Most of the names led nowhere. People who had died, disappeared from the industry, or simply couldn't be found. Then I struck gold. Tucked into an old address book, I found a name with a star next to it. Bob Harrington, original cast, good guy. Next to it, a phone number that had been crossed out and rewritten several times. With nothing to lose, I dialed it, fully expecting a disconnected line or a stranger. Instead, a gravelly voice answered, Harrington. My heart nearly stopped. Mr. Harrington? My name is Thomas. Jack Thomas was my grandfather. He wrote a screenplay called Burnt Hearts back in the 70s, and I believe you were cast in it. A long pause. So long I thought he'd hung up. Then, Jack's grandson? Well, I'll be damned. Jack Thomas. Haven't heard that name in 40 years. 2 days later, I was driving to Los Angeles with Grandpa's screenplay riding shotgun like a sacred text. I'd emptied my meager savings account, packed a suitcase full of his notes and a VHS tape, and pointed my Honda toward the city of angels. The desert gradually gave way to sprawling suburbs, then the dense urban landscape of L.A. I felt small beneath the towering billboards and palm trees, a nobody from Nevada, with a crazy story and a viral TikTok. Bob Harrington had agreed to meet me at a coffee shop in Burbank, one of those old-school places that hadn't changed since the 70s, with red vinyl booths and waitresses who called everyone honey. He was easy to spot, tall even at 80, with a shock of white hair and the kind of face that had once graced movie posters. He'd had a decent career. Never a leading man, but steady character work in TV and film for decades. I slid into the booth across from him, the screenplay clutched in my hands like a lifeline. You look like him, Bob said, studying my face. Same eyes. Same way of hunching your shoulders like you're expecting bad news. The waitress brought us coffee in thick white mugs that could have been the same ones they used when Grandpa lived here. "So, you found Jack's script," Bob continued, his voice dropping lower, eyes darting around the smoky cafe like he was checking for eavesdroppers. That thing was dynamite, pure dynamite. For the next hour, Bob told me about the original production, how excited everyone had been, how the network had fast-tracked it, unusual for a complex drama about Hollywood's dark side, how they'd shot the pilot, and were gearing up for a full season. "It was based on real stuff, you know," he said, leaning forward, eyes gleaming like he was back on set. "That screenplay was about a studio mogul whose secrets scared the hell out of the top brass. The main character, the one I played, was investigating corruption that went all the way to Washington. What happened?" I asked, breathless. Bob's face darkened. "One day we show up to set, and everything's gone. Equipment, costumes, props, all gone. The producer tells us production is indefinitely postponed. Next day, our contracts are canceled. Kill fees paid. Everyone told to forget about it." He tapped a gnarled finger on the screenplay. "They destroyed the footage. At least, that's what they told us. Your grandfather was blacklisted for a while after that. Not officially, but you know how Hollywood works. Suddenly, his calls weren't returned. Projects fell through. But why?" I pressed. What was so dangerous about this story? Bob shrugged, but his eyes told a different story. "Some things, even now, it's better not to say out loud, kid, but your grandfather? He had guts, real guts." As we parted, he gripped my shoulder with surprising strength. "Jack deserved better. If you're really going to tell this story, be careful." I left the cafe with more questions and answers, but also with something I hadn't felt in years. The thrill of chasing a real story. The kind of story that matters. Back in my cheap motel room, I posted another TikTok, this one featuring snippets of my conversation with Bob, with his permission. I was careful not to make specific allegations, but the mystery of the abandoned show resonated with people. The comments section exploded again. "This is like a real-life Chinatown, but for TV. Hollywood has always buried the truth. Expose them. I'm investing in whatever you're making. Take my money now." That night, Sara called me. "I'm in L.A.," she said without preamble. "I watched your TikToks. I've been researching your grandfather's work. This is bigger than you think." We agreed to meet the next day at the Hollywood Walk of Fame, touristy and public enough to feel safe after Bob's cryptic warning. Sara was shorter than I expected, with an energy that seemed to vibrate around her. She carried a professional camera bag and had the focused look of someone who was always framing shots in her mind. We walked along the stars embedded in the sidewalk, stepping around tourists and street performers. She told me about her own career struggles, how she left a promising job at a major network to make documentaries about things that actually matter. "My father told me dreams are for fools," she said, staring down at the stars, some forgotten actress from the 50s. "He wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer, something stable." I nodded, feeling the weight of family expectations that we both carried. "But your grandfather's words in that script," she continued, "they reminded me why I picked up a camera in the first place. For the first time in years, I felt something inside me shift. The loneliness that had been my constant companion since choosing journalism over my family's wishes seemed to recede. Here was someone who understood what it meant to chase truth instead of security. "Dreams aren't what you see when you're sleeping," I said, remembering another of Grandpa's favorite sayings. "They're what keeps you from sleeping." Sara smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her. "Exactly." For the rest of the afternoon, we walked and talked, sharing stories about failed projects and small victories. She showed me footage from her documentaries on her phone, and I shared more of Grandpa's notes. That evening, back at my motel room, I showed Sara photos of the trailer on our Zoom call. "Welcome to my 5-star inheritance." I joked, scrolling through pictures of the cramped space, where every appliance is older than both of us combined. She laughed, a sound that traveled through my phone and seemed to brighten the dingy motel room. "That's not a trailer, Thomas. That's a museum. The production design alone is priceless. Her enthusiasm made me see the space through new eyes, not as junk, but as a perfectly preserved time capsule, an era when people like my grandfather fought to tell meaningful stories. By the end of the call, an idea had formed between us, dangerous and exhilarating. "What if," Sara said, her eyes intense even through the small screen, "we actually make this, not as a documentary about a lost screenplay, but as the film itself, your grandfather's vision, exactly as he intended it?" "The studios buried it once," I reminded her. "What makes you think they wouldn't do it again?" She smiled, and there was something fierce in it. "Because this time, we're not asking permission. We're not making it for studios. We're making it for people." We stayed on that call until 3 a.m., planning, dreaming, arguing over approaches. Sara had equipment. I had the screenplay and Grandpa's insider knowledge of the events that inspired it. Between us, we had just enough connections to make something happen. As the sun began to rise over Los Angeles, we made a pact. We would bring Burnt Hearts back to life. Not as a Hollywood production, but as the independent film my grandfather had always wanted it to be. "For the truth," Sara said. "For Grandpa," I replied. We sealed our agreement with a virtual handshake, as the faded star of some forgotten actor glowed on the wall behind her. The morning after our Zoom call, Sara sent me a link to a blank Kickstarter page. Just the title, Burnt Hearts. The film they buried in a $30,000 goal. "Are we really doing this?" I texted her. "Make the video," she replied. "Tell your grandfather's story. I'll handle the rest." I'd never launched a crowdfunding campaign before. The closest I'd come was donating $20 to my college roommate's revolutionary potato salad business that lasted approximately 2 weeks. But something about Grandpa's screenplay and the millions of views on TikTok gave me courage I'd never felt before. I set up my phone in the motel room, the screenplay visible beside me, and hit record. "My grandfather wrote a story so dangerous Hollywood buried it," I said, trying to sound confident rather than paranoid. "Now we're bringing it back to life, exactly as he intended. No studios, no censorship, just truth." I explained the story, how it exposed corruption in both Hollywood and Washington, how it was almost made before mysteriously being shut down, how the footage was allegedly destroyed. I read another passage from the screenplay, one that gave me chills every time. "Truth isn't what you're told. It's what you feel in your bones, even when everyone tells you you're crazy." Sara edited the video, adding clips from my TikToks, photos of Grandpa from his Hollywood days, and haunting music that made everything feel like a thriller. We launched a campaign with a $30,000 goal. Enough, Sara said, to shoot a bare-bones version in Texas where she had connections. Then we waited. The first donation came in before I'd even closed my laptop. $50 from someone named Dream Chaser 22. Then another, and another. By morning, we'd hit $5,000. By evening, $50,000. The campaign exploded in a way neither of us had anticipated. Articles appeared on indie film sites. Viral TikToker resurrects grandfather's dangerous lost screenplay. Comments poured in from people claiming to remember rumors about the original production. Others sharing stories about creative projects that had been shut down for getting too close to the truth. A week later, we hit $400,000. I posted a stunned update on TikTok. Before this, my content was seen by exactly me and my neighbor's coyote. Now we have enough to actually make this thing. Grandpa, if you're watching from wherever, your story is coming back. 20 million views in 3 days. Sara and I spoke constantly, our excitement growing with each donation. We were no longer just two struggling creatives with a pipe dream. We were the stewards of something people genuinely cared about. When the campaign closed at just over $450,000, we knew we had to move fast. The clock was ticking. Not just on delivering to our backers, but on keeping the momentum going before people forgot about us and moved on to the next viral sensation. Sara had connections in Austin, Texas, a thriving indie film scene with enough talent to pull this off without Hollywood prices. We agreed to meet there the following week to start pre-production. I packed up Grandpa's trailer, securing his notes and the precious VHS tape in a fireproof box I bought specifically for that purpose. Something about Bob Harrington's warnings had me looking over my shoulder, half expecting men in dark suits to appear in the desert. The drive from Nevada to Texas gave me plenty of time to think. About Grandpa, about the story we were about to tell, about Sara, especially about Sara. We'd only known each other a few weeks, but something about chasing this project together had created a bond one couldn't explain. Like we were conspirators in the best possible way. I arrived in Austin feeling both exhausted and more alive than I'd been in years. The city hummed with creative energy. Street musicians on every corner, colorful murals covering building sides, food trucks serving everything imaginable. It felt like the antithesis of the corporate Hollywood that had buried Grandpa's story. Sara had rented a small warehouse on the outskirts of town, our makeshift studio and production office. When I walked in, she was already there, surrounded by printouts of the screenplay taped to the walls, a whiteboard filled with production notes, and a table covered in camera equipment. "Our kingdom," she said, gesturing around with a grin. The next few weeks passed in a blur of casting calls, location scouting, and endless revisions to make the screenplay work with our budget. I found myself rewriting scenes I'd initially considered untouchable, always with Grandpa's voice in my head. The story matters more than the words, Tommy. The words are just a vehicle. We found our cast through a combination of Instagram calls, local theater companies, and pure luck. No big names, but people with talent and hunger in their eyes. People who connected with the story in the same way we did. Bob Harrington surprised us both by showing up in Austin, offering to play a supporting role. The newspaper editor who helps the protagonist expose the truth. "I'm not doing this for an Oscar," he grumbled during his first day on set. "I'm doing it for the truth. And for Jack." Our equipment came from a film student who rented us his gear at half price in exchange for a production credit. Our sets were built by volunteers using what scavenged from construction sites and curtains from thrift stores. We shot in an abandoned studio space that smelled of dust and history and possibility. Our budget is coffee, pizza, and my grandfather's faith. I joked to the crew during our first production meeting. But behind the joke was a truth that had begun to define this whole crazy journey. We were making something not because it made financial sense, but because it mattered. Each day brought new challenges. Cameras malfunctioned. Actors forgot lines. Rain delayed outdoor shoots. But each problem solved brought us closer together as a team. We weren't just making a film. We were building a community around Grandpa's story. Sara emerged as a natural director. Passionate, meticulous, with an eye for details I would have missed. She pushed everyone to dig deeper, to find the truth in each scene. "Thomas, stop hiding behind the camera like a mouse," she'd call out when I tried to fade into the background during difficult scenes. "This is your grandfather's legacy. Own it." Slowly, I began to find my voice as a producer. The journalist in me knew how to ask questions, how to find the heart of the story. The grandson in me knew what Grandpa would have wanted. 3 weeks into filming, the call came. Thomas, this is Elliot Bryce from Paramount Pictures." My heart stopped. Paramount was one of the biggest studios in Hollywood. "We've been watching your project with interest." The smooth voice continued. "Very interesting backstory. Great hook. We'd like to make you an offer for the rights." I listened, stunned, as he laid it out. $2 million for the screenplay and all associated rights. A chance to develop it with proper resources. The opportunity to honor your grandfather's work on a larger scale. "There would need to be some changes, of course," Bryce added casually. "The ending is a bit problematic from a commercial standpoint. Audiences prefer resolution, redemption, and some of the political elements might need toning down. Nothing major." I thanked him and said I'd think about it. That night, I paced our empty set, Grandpa's words echoing in my mind. "Truth isn't a commodity, Tommy. It's fire. It burns, it illuminates, it destroys and rebuilds. But the moment you try to sell it, it dies." $2 million would change my life. It would pay off my student loans. It would give me freedom to write what I wanted. It would validate everything I'd been working toward. I called Sara to tell her about the offer. "That's a lot of money," she said after a long pause. It could give us a real studio, Thomas, resources, distribution. But I could hear the hesitation in her voice. She walked away from a network job because they kept diluting her vision. She understood what was at stake. "What would your grandfather say?" she asked finally. We both knew the answer. The next morning, I called Elliot Bryce and turned down the offer. "You're making a mistake, kid," he said, his voice suddenly lacking its previous warmth. "This story won't see the light of day without proper backing." "That's where you're wrong," I replied, feeling something like Grandpa's spirit flowing through me. "It's already seeing the light of day. On our terms." That afternoon, we shot one of the most challenging scenes in the script, where the protagonist realizes the woman he loves has been using him, but also that her betrayal has led him to a greater truth. As I watched our actors bring those words to life, I knew we'd made the right choice. That night, Sara and I sat on the roof of the warehouse, looking up at the vast Texas sky, filled with more stars than I'd ever seen in Vegas. A bottle of cheap whiskey passed between us, celebrating both our defiance and our terror at having turned down life-changing money. "You know what your grandfather told me about this screenplay?" Bob had said earlier that day. He said, "The biggest victories are the ones you pay for with your heart." I never understood that until now. The night air was cool, but I felt warm with purpose in the whiskey and Sara's presence beside me. "I gave up on my dreams because my dad convinced me they were childish," she said quietly, staring up at the stars. "But your grandfather," his words reminded me why I picked up a camera in the first place. She turned to look at me, her eyes reflecting pinpricks of starlight. "You gave me back my wings, Thomas." I don't know who moved first. Maybe we both did. But suddenly we were kissing under that infinite Texas sky, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Like all the chaos and struggle of the past weeks had been leading to this moment. When we pulled apart, both slightly breathless, she laughed, a sound of pure joy that echoed across the rooftop. The next day, I posted a new TikTok. Said no to Hollywood. Said yes to the truth. My trailer is cooler than their offices anyway. 20 million views in 24 hours. The comments section exploded with support. "This is the most punk rock thing I've ever seen. Your grandfather would be so proud. Take my money again. I'd fund you twice." The rejection of the offer seemed to resonate even more than the original story. People connected with the idea of choosing principles over paycheck, passion over pragmatism. It was the American dream turned inside out. Success measured not in dollars, but in integrity. The final week of shooting was a blur of 18-hour days, last-minute rewrites, and a growing certainty that we were creating something special. The cast and crew had become a family, united by the belief that this story deserved to be told. On the last day, we gathered for the final scene, where the protagonist finally exposes a corruption, knowing it will cost him everything but his integrity. As the camera rolled and our lead actor delivered Grandpa's word with perfect emotional pitch, I felt a presence beside me that I couldn't explain. Like Grandpa was there, watching his truth finally come to life. When the director of photography called cut, on the final take, the warehouse erupted in cheers and tears. People who had started as strangers now embraced like old friends. Bob Harrington wiped tears from his eyes, muttering something about dust in the air. Sara found me in the chaos, her camera still in hand, her face flushed with triumph. "We're making the film that will change everything," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not just for us, but for everyone who's ever had their truth buried." I nodded, clutching Grandpa's screenplay, now dog-eared, coffee-stained and marked with our revisions, but still beating with the heart of his original vision. In that moment, standing amid the makeshift sets and borrowed equipment, surrounded by people who had become believers in a story that had almost been lost to time, I knew that regardless of what happened next, we had already won. We had chosen truth over compromise, passion over practicality. We had made the film my grandfather always intended to make, not for studios or executives, but for everyone who needed to hear its message. The 6 months after we wrapped filming on Burnt Hearts were a blur of editing sessions, sound mixing, color correction, and 1,000 other details that transformed raw footage into an actual movie. Sara and I practically lived in the small editing suite we'd rented in Austin, surviving on takeout and determination. We submitted the finished film to Sundance with exactly 27 minutes to spare before the deadline. Then came the waiting, that special kind of torture where you try to convince yourself you don't care about the outcome while obsessively checking your email every 5 minutes. When the acceptance email arrived on a random Tuesday morning, I stared at it for a full minute, convinced it was spam. Then Sarah's screaming phone call confirmed it was real. We were in, not just in some obscure category, but in the U.S. dramatic competition, the main event. Our TikTok announcement broke my previous record, hitting 30 million views in less than 2 days. The community that formed around Grandpa's story celebrated with us. Thousands of comments flooding in from people who felt personally invested in our success. We become something larger than ourselves, a symbol of independent storytelling that refused to be silenced. We're going to Sundance, Sara kept saying in disbelief as we packed our bag for Utah. I'd never been to a film festival before, let alone the most prestigious one in America. The scene in Park City was overwhelming. Celebrities brushing shoulders with industry executives. Filmmakers frantically networking, journalists hunting for the next big story. And somehow, impossibly, we were part of it. Our premiere was scheduled for the second day of the festival, in one of the main theaters. I bought a second-hand suit that almost fit, and Sara had found a vintage dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of one of Grandpa's old films. In the green room before the screening, I felt like I might throw up. What if they hate it? I whispered to Sara. What if Grandpa was wrong and this story doesn't resonate anymore? She squeezed my hand. Your grandfather understood something timeless. Truth doesn't expire. Then it was time. We walked into the packed theater, the lights dimmed, and Burnt Hearts began to play. Seeing our film on the big screen with an audience was surreal. Every laugh in the right place felt like validation. Every gasp at a reveal felt like victory. I watched the faces around me, illuminated by the screen. Strangers completely absorbed in my grandfather's story. In our story, when the credits rolled, there was a moment of complete silence, and then the theater erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, some wiping tears from their eyes. The Q&A session afterward was a blur. People asking about the original screenplay, about Grandpa, about the truth behind the fiction. Sara fielded most of the questions while I sat there in shocked silence, still processing what had just happened. Then someone asked about the studio offer we'd turned down. We chose integrity over compromise, Sara said simply. We believed the story deserved to be told exactly as it was written. The crowd erupted again. In that moment, I understood something fundamental about storytelling that Grandpa had tried to teach me. When you speak truth, even through fiction, people recognize it in their bones. The next few days were a whirlwind of interviews, additional screenings, and industry parties where executives who would never have returned my calls a year ago suddenly wanted to talk distribution deals. Through it all, Sara and I clung to each other like survivors of shipwreck, overwhelmed but exhilarated. Then came the closing ceremony. We sat in the audience without expectations. Just being at Sundance had exceeded any dream I'd ever had. When they announced Burnt Hearts as the winner of the grand jury prize, the highest honor of the festival, I froze completely. Sara had to push me toward the stage. I walked up in a daze, looking out at the sea of faces. Industry veterans, celebrities, critics, all applauding a story that had almost been lost to time. Standing at the microphone in my second-hand suit, I leaned down to whisper to Sara, "Is this real, or did I accidentally eat a bad taco?" She laughed, tears in her eyes, as I accepted the award with shaking hands. "This is for my grandfather," I said into the microphone, my voice steadier than I felt. Who will believe that some stories are worth fighting for, even when the world tries to bury them? The applause was deafening. In that moment, I felt Grandpa's presence more strongly than ever, not as a ghost, but as a legacy continued, as if he'd passed me a baton I never knew I was meant to carry. The aftermath of Sundance was like falling into a parallel universe. Suddenly, my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Agents, producers, streaming platforms, people offering deals that made the original $2 million look like pocket change. Netflix came in with a $7 million offer for exclusive streaming rights. The catch? They wanted creative control over marketing and potential series development. Sara and I spent a night debating it in our hotel room. We'd proven our point at Sundance. The film would be seen. Grandpa's story would be told. Did it matter who distributed it now? What matters, Sara said finally, is that the story remains intact. His ending. His truth. We negotiated hard, eventually securing a deal that guaranteed the film would stream exactly as we'd made it, with no changes to content. The money would allow us to pay everyone who'd worked for reduced rates or deferred payment, with enough left over to fund our next projects independently. The day after signing the Netflix deal, my phone rang with a number I hadn't seen in months. My mother. "Thomas," she said, her voice unusually soft. "I just saw the news about your film. About Dad's screenplay." My heart hammered in my chest. "And we always knew you were special," she said. The words I'd waited years to hear. "Your father and I, we were wrong to push you away from what you loved." Anger flared bright and sudden. "You called my dreams garbage." I reminded her. "You said I was wasting my potential." The silence on the line stretched uncomfortably. "We were afraid," she admitted finally. "Afraid you'd struggle like Dad did, that you'd be hurt by an industry that nearly broke him." I remembered something Grandpa used to say when I'd ask why he still sent birthday cards to my parents even when they rarely called him. "Family is who comes back, even when they're late." We talked for over an hour. Really talked, maybe for the first time in my adult life. About Grandpa, about dreams, about fear disguised as practicality. By the end, we were both crying, holding phones so our ears miles apart, but somehow closer than we'd been in years. "I'm proud of you," she said before hanging up. "And your grandfather would be too." With the Netflix deal finalized and the film set to stream globally in 2 months, Sara and I took our first real break since this crazy journey began. We rented a car and drove back to Nevada, back to where it all started, Grandpa's trailer in the desert. The place looked smaller somehow, less significant now that its secrets had been revealed to the world. But it was still mine, my inheritance, my beginning. What happens now? Sara asked as we sat on rusty lawn chairs watching the sunset paint the desert in impossible colors. What happened was this. I used some Netflix money to buy a new trailer, a modern one with actual working plumbing and electricity that didn't flicker during storms. But I kept the vintage feel with old-fashioned lamps and a dedicated shelf for Grandpa's scripts. I converted the original trailer into a mobile screening room, outfitted with a proper projector and sound system. Over the next year, Sara and I took Burnt Hearts on the road, showing it in small towns across America where independent films rarely screen, hosting discussions about truth and storytelling afterward. Sara received a grant to create a documentary series about forgotten screenwriters, tracking down stories similar to my grandfather's, creative voices silenced by an industry that sometimes feared authenticity more than it valued art. Burnt Hearts became one of Netflix's top 3 streaming films that year. Critics called it a searing indictment of power structures and a love letter to truth-tellers everywhere. But more meaningful were the messages from ordinary people who said the film had inspired them to revive their own abandoned creative projects. I wrote a memoir called My Grandfather's Tape about our journey from inheritance to Sundance. To my shock, it hit the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for 11 weeks. People connected with the story behind the story, the tale of voices silenced and eventually heard. We made millions, technically, but you wouldn't know it by looking at us. We still live primarily in the trailer, now upgraded with better tech, but still deliberately simple. We traveled constantly, screening the film, finding new stories, living the kind of nomadic creative life Grandpa would have loved. 6 months after Sundance, on a clear desert night with stars scattered across the sky like spilled diamonds, I took Sara to the roof of the original trailer, now parked permanently back in his Nevada home. I'd strung lights across the metal roof, their glow soft against the vastness of the desert night. The air was cool, the silence absolute except for the occasional distant coyote. This is where it all began, I said, my heart pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. With an inheritance everyone else saw as trash. Sara smiled, her face illuminated by the string lights. Your grandfather knew better. He saw potential in things other people dismissed. I agreed, including me. I reached into my pocket, fingers closing around the small box I'd been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Another inheritance. This one from my grandmother, a simple vintage ring my grandfather had saved for years to buy her. Sara, I said, kneeling awkwardly on the metal roof, you believe in my story. Will you believe in our story? She burst out laughing, not the reaction I'd been hoping for. Thomas, are you seriously proposing on top of a trailer? She asked, eyes dancing with amusement. If you say no, I'll be left with just this trailer and a broken heart. I said, trying to keep my voice steady despite her laughter. She knelt down across from me, taking my hands in hers. I like the trailer better, she teased, before pulling me into a kiss that answered my question more eloquently than words. I slipped the ring onto her finger under the vast Nevada sky, feeling like we'd come full circle, from an inheritance of supposed junk to a future built on rediscovered treasure. Grandpa's voice seemed to echo in my mind. Life is a story you write with the people around you. In that moment, with Sara's hand in mine, I understood what he meant more clearly than ever before. The wedding happened 6 months later, right there in the desert. No fancy venue, just a trailer decorated with wildflowers and string lights, surrounded by the friends we'd made on our journey. The cast and crew of Burnt Hearts, Bob Harrington looking dapper in a vintage suit, even my parents awkward but trying. We wrote our own vows, of course. Mine included one of Grandpa's favorite sayings. Love is when two people decide to tell one story. After the success of Burnt Hearts and my memoir, we founded what we called the Untold America Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to finding and funding screenwriters whose stories have been rejected or silenced. Our motto, painted on the side of the original trailer that now served as our mobile office, not trash, just untold. We're saving dreams, I explained to a reporter who interviewed us for a magazine profile. Though my mattress still looks like a prop from a horror movie. The foundation became our mission, traveling the country in our trailer, finding stories that deserve to be told, giving voice to the voiceless. We uncovered scripts hidden in attics, memoirs tucked in drawers, documentaries abandoned for lack of funding. Burnt Hearts continued to exceed expectations, hovering in Netflix's top rankings long after new releases should have pushed it aside. Critics began using it as a reference point for authentic storytelling. Film schools added it to their curriculum. But the real victory wasn't the acclaim or the money. It was in the community that formed around what we were doing. People began sending us their own untold stories, not just screenplays, but family histories, local legends, personal journeys. A tapestry of American experience that had been overlooked by mainstream media. Sara developed a TV series called Forgotten Treasures, exploring America's overlooked creative spaces, from abandoned movie theaters to community playhouses to retirement homes full of people with extraordinary stories. It wasn't a massive hit, but it found its audience, people who believed, as we did, that every story matters. On our wedding day, standing among our friends and family in the desert, I read one of Grandpa's lines from a letter he'd written me years ago. A story is only as worthy as the person who tells it. Sara leaned close to whisper in my ear, we told the best one. The trailer gleamed in the sunset. The words, not trash, just untold, catching the golden light. Around us, the desert stretched endlessly, a blank page waiting for new stories to be written. Life isn't about the destination, as Grandpa would say, but the road you travel with those you love. During the reception, as people danced under string lights strung between Joshua trees, I pulled Sara close. You married a guy who lives in a trailer, I said, grinning. You're definitely crazy. She laughed, her eyes reflecting the desert stars above us. It's the best trailer in the world. And it was, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. The beginning of a story that almost wasn't told, a legacy that almost disappeared, a truth that refused to stay buried. The following morning, Sara and I climbed into our trailer, the one with not trash, just untold, painted proudly on its side. The dashboard was covered with notes about our next destination, a small town in Montana where a retired teacher had written a screenplay about the local mining community that no one would touch because it criticized a powerful corporation. Another untold story waiting for someone to believe in it. Another truth needing a voice. As we drove away, the desert spread out before us like possibility itself. Endless, challenging, beautiful in its vastness. The road ahead was long, but we were telling our story together now. Word by word, mile by mile, truth by truth. And somewhere, I knew, Grandpa was smiling.